Everyone thought this cabin would freeze. They were wrong.
There is a particular kind of cold that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with drama or warning. It simply settles the way a stone settles into river mud, slowly, completely, and with a permanence that makes you forget there was ever anything else. The people of Harlan Creek, Montana knew this kind of cold the way they knew the shape of their own hands. They had lived beside it for years. They had learned to read its early signs in the color of the November sky, in the way the horses stood with their backs to the wind, in the sound the frozen ground made under a boot heel when the temperature dropped past a certain point, and the earth itself seemed to pull inward, contracting against what was coming. By the second week of November 1886, every family in the valley had begun the ritual that marked the true start of winter in this part of the world. Wood was the language of survival here, and the size of a man's woodpile was as readable as a sentence. You could walk the road that ran the length of Harlan Creek and understand from the stacks outside each door something true about the family inside. A tall, tight pile meant competence and foresight. A thin, hastily gathered stack meant trouble was already beginning. No pile at all meant something that nobody wanted to say out loud. There were 41 families in Harlan Creek that November. If you walked the road in the gray morning light and counted the chimney stacks rising above the tree line, you would count 41 columns of wood smoke drifting northeast in the thin air. 41 fires, 41 families doing what everyone in this valley did, burning what they had gathered and hoping it was enough. At the far end of the road where the trail curved west toward a low hillside and the trees thinned out into open scrub, there was one more cabin, small plain framed in lodgepole pine with a stone foundation that had settled deep into the earth over 30 years of freeze and thaw. The cabin had one chimney. On most mornings that November, no smoke rose from it. No woodpile stood outside the door. No stacked timber leaned against the wall. No split quarters of pine or fir or mountain ash waiting in orderly rows for the serious cold to arrive. There was nothing outside that cabin to suggest the person living in it understood what was coming. The people of Harlan Creek had been watching that cabin all autumn. They watched it the way you watch something that troubles you without your being able to say exactly why. Some of them had offered to help. Some of them had warned. Most of them had talked among themselves in the way that small communities talk when one of their own appears to be making a fatal mistake and cannot be persuaded otherwise. By November, they had largely moved on from concern to something quieter and sadder. They had begun to accept what they believed was inevitable. They were wrong, but they did not know that yet. Her name was Cordelia Gorham. She was 34 years old. She had been living alone in that cabin for 6 years, since the autumn of 1880, when her husband Edmund walked out the door with a travel bag and the address of a silver mine in Nevada and did not come back. He had sent one letter in the first year. Nothing after that. In a settlement of 41 families spread across a valley floor, a story like that does not stay private for long, and the story of Edmund Gorham had been told and retold and quietly revised over the years until it had taken on the particular shape that abandoned women's stories always take, in close communities, a mixture of sympathy and judgment that the person at the center of it can feel without anyone ever saying it directly. Cordelia had learned to carry that weight the way you carry a stone in your boot. Always there, always uncomfortable, something you eventually stop noticing because there is simply nothing to be done about it. She had 11 acres of rocky land, 6 chickens, 1 aging draft horse named Tinder, and that cabin her father had built by hand when the valley was still wilderness and the nearest town was 2 days east by horse. She had a summer garden that produced more than people expected from that soil. She had her father's tools worn smooth at the handles, their irons still sharp from the last time he had filed them. And she had her father's leather notebook, a thick volume with a dark cover and pages so dense with small, precise handwriting that a person unfamiliar with it might have thought it was a surveyor's record or an engineer's manual, rather than what it actually was, the accumulated knowledge of a man who had spent his entire life thinking carefully about one very specific problem. Her father's name was Garner Gorham. He had been born in the Telemark region of Norway, in a place where winters lasted 6 months and fuel was never plentiful. And the families who survived generation after generation were not the ones who burned the most wood, but the ones who understood the most deeply how cold moved through the world and how it could be slowed. Gunnar had come to Montana as a young man with almost nothing in material terms. No money to speak of, no influential connections, no head start of any kind. What he brought was knowledge-specific, inherited, generational knowledge that had been passed to him the way certain things are passed between fathers and children, in places where survival depends on precision, not through formal instruction, but through the slow accumulation of witnessed experience. Cordelia had been 8 years old the first time she truly understood what her father knew. It was a winter night cold enough that the bark on the birch trees outside was splitting with sounds like distant rifle shots, and her father had taken her hand and led her down into the cellar beneath the cabin. He told her to take off one of her mittens and press her bare palm against the earth wall. She did, and what she felt stopped her. It was not cold. The wall was not warm in the way a stove is warm, not radiating heat that you could feel from a distance. But against her palm, the earth held a steady, deep, even temperature that had nothing to do with the frozen world above. It felt patient. It felt old. It felt like something that had been at exactly that temperature for a very long time and intended to remain there regardless of what the sky decided to do. Her father watched her face and smiled. He said in the careful English he had spent years assembling, "The earth does not remember seasons, Cordelia. Go deep enough and the earth only remembers itself." He explained it to her that night, and she listened the way children listen to things that feel important without yet being able to say why. The ground at a depth of 6 to 8 feet below the frost line maintains a nearly constant temperature throughout the entire year. It does not matter whether the surface is frozen solid in February or baked dry in August. At 7 feet of depth, the soil temperature in this part of Montana sits between 45 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit stable and predictable season after season, decade after decade. The earth absorbs the sun's energy slowly over centuries and releases it just as slowly, smoothing out the violent swings of the surface into something steady and reliable, and if you knew how to use it, extraordinarily useful. What Gunnar had built beneath the floor of that cabin was a system that used the Earth's stable temperature as a heat source. Outside air entered through a buried clay pipe on the north side of the cabin, traveled 22 feet underground, at a depth of 7 feet passed through a stone-lined chamber where 900 pounds of creek rock held the ground's temperature and rose through a central column into the living space above. The air that entered the room was not hot. It was simply no longer cold. And in a properly sealed cabin, air that entered at 48 or 50 degrees and was supplemented by a soapstone shell that could be charged with a small fire of 4 or 5 pieces of hardwood for 2 hours each evening was enough. More than enough. The total wood consumed over a full winter season was 1/4 of a standard cord. Cordelia's nearest neighbor burned 3 to 4 cords every year. A family with children burned more. Cordelia had first seen the system work as a child. She had felt it in the floors every winter of her childhood, that sourceless, steady warmth rising through the planks, and she had promised herself that someday she would build it again. When Edmund left and the winters became hers alone to face, she understood that someday had arrived. She had not opened her father's notebook for 6 years after he died, not because she had forgotten it, because every time she reached for it, she heard his voice reading the lines aloud, patient and precise. The way he read everything, and the specific weight of that sound in her chest was more than she was willing to carry on a regular day. It was not grief exactly. It was closer to the feeling of a door that you know is there and choose not to open because you are not yet ready for what is on the other side. The summer of 1884, she opened it. She sat at the table in the early morning before the heat came, turned to the first page, and did not read for a long time. She just looked at his handwriting. Then she began. She started digging in June of that year, before the heat of July made the work unbearable. She used her father's long-handled spade and a short-handled grub hoe whose iron head still held an edge. She removed the soil in wooden buckets, carried each load up a timber ramp she built from fence posts and scrap planking, and deposited it in a low depression east of the cabin. The work was slow. The first 2 feet came up easily enough, dark topsoil that broke clean from the spade. Then 18 inches of dense clay subsoil that came up in heavy slabs and clung to the iron and required the grub hoe to break apart. Then the mineral earth below, pale and compacted, layered with broken stone. At 7 feet of depth on the hottest week of August, She pressed her father's mercury thermometer against the exposed wall and waited 5 minutes. 51 degrees, the same temperature her father had recorded in his notebook 30 years before, in a different valley in different soil. She wrote the number in the margin of the notebook in handwriting as small and precise as his. The digging took most of 2 summers. The total volume of earth she removed was approximately 40 cubic yards. Her neighbors watched her work with an expression she had come to recognize, the particular look that people have when they believe they are witnessing a mistake being made in slow motion and cannot decide whether their obligation is to intervene or simply to wait. The man who watched most closely was Mortimer Blackmore. Blackmore was 52 years old and had been the most respected builder in Harlan Creek for the better part of 2 decades. He had framed cabins, laid foundations split, and stacked more timber than he could easily count, and served as the valley's informal authority on construction and winter preparation. If you wanted to know whether your roof would hold a heavy snow load, you asked Blackmore. If you needed to know how much wood to lay in for a hard winter, you asked Blackmore. He had built or substantially repaired structures for more than half the families in the valley, and the income that came from that work, the material and the labor, and the advice was the foundation of everything he had. When Cordelia began digging in the summer of 1884, Blackmore walked over to the fence line and watched her for a while without speaking. Then he asked what she was building. She told him in straightforward terms the principle of the system and what she intended to construct. He listened with the expression of a man who has already formed his opinion and is only waiting for the other person to finish. When she was done, he looked at the hole she had dug, looked at her and said it with enough volume that the 2 men working nearby could hear clearly, "You are digging your own grave, Mrs. Gorham." A little wide, but close enough to the right size. He said it as if Ed were a practical observation. He walked back toward the road. The 2 men who had heard it said nothing, but they did not forget it either, and within a week the remark had traveled to enough households in the valley that Cordelia could feel it in the way people looked at her when she passed. What Blackmore did not say, what he perhaps did not fully articulate even to himself, was the thing underneath the dismissal. He was not a stupid man. He knew the history of building. He had heard stories, fragments, second-hand accounts of methods that did not rely on conventional firewood heating. He understood at some level that the frontier had not invented all the knowledge it used, that some of what passed for common sense in this valley was simply the first thing that had worked well enough and never been questioned. What Blackmore understood, and what made his opposition to Cordelia sharper than simple skepticism, was that if she was right, then everything he had spent 20 years building, his expertise, his reputation, his income, his standing in the community, as the man who knew how things should be done, rested on a foundation that was less solid than he had believed. He did not examine that understanding closely. It is easier not to. In the summer of 1885, when Cordelia had completed the underground chamber and was ready to begin laying the clay tile intake channel, she traveled to Millerton to purchase the material she needed. The supply yard in town carried what she wanted. She had calculated the quantities precisely from her father's notebook. She had the money saved. What she did not know was that Blackmore had been to Millerton 2 weeks before her. The owner of the supply yard was a man named Silas Pendleton. Pendleton was a practical businessman who did not particularly concern himself with the private lives of his customers so long as they paid their accounts. But when a man of Blackmore's standing and long relationship with the yard came to him and spoke in careful, measured terms about a widow woman in Harlan Creek, who was in Blackmore's phrasing not in a settled state of mind and very possibly unable to honor her debts, Pendleton listened. When Cordelia arrived and presented her order, Pendleton told her he was unable to fill it at this time. Cordelia stood at the counter for a moment. She looked at him. Then she reached into the front pocket of her coat, counted out the full amount in cash, and placed it on the counter between them. She said nothing. She simply looked at him and waited. Pendleton hesitated. He looked at the money. He looked at her face, which was absolutely still, and at her hands, which were not. From the back of the yard, a young man of about 19 had been listening. His name was Burkett Eastwick. He was the son of a farming family that had come to the valley 3 years ago with little money and considerable ambition. Burkett had been working for Pendleton since he was 17, learning the supply trade, learning which materials did what, learning the slow grammar of building. He stepped through the doorway and said without particular force or emotion, but clearly enough for everyone in the room to hear, "Mr. Pendleton." Cash in hand, we sell materials. That is what we do here. Pendleton looked at Burkett. He looked at the money again. He filled the order. Cordelia loaded the tiles onto her wagon herself. Burkett helped carry the heavier crates without being asked and without saying anything further. She thanked him. He nodded and went back to work. She left Miller Ayrton in the late afternoon. The road back to Harlan Creek ran 18 miles through a stretch of country that was empty and flat for the first half and then narrowed between stands of pine as it entered the valley proper. She was 4 miles out when the right rear wheel dropped into a rut hidden under standing water, and the wagon lurched hard to the left. The wheel did not break, but it was lodged at an angle that her horse Tinder, old as he was, could not pull free. She climbed down. The light was going. The temperature was dropping in that quick way. It dropped in September when the sun fell below the ridgeline and the air changed character in under an hour. She stood behind the wagon and looked at 200 clay tiles stacked in wooden crates and a wheel buried 8 inches in Montana mud. She stood there for a while doing nothing. Not because she did not know what to do. She had been solving problems alone for 6 years, and she knew perfectly well how to assess this one. She stood there because in that moment in the failing light, with the cold coming on and the empty road stretching in both directions, something in her that she usually kept very tightly managed became briefly unmanageable. She was not afraid of the cold or the darkness or the stranded wagon. She was tired. Not in the body, though her body was tired. She was tired in the deeper place where a person keeps track of how much they have been asked to do alone and how long it has been since anyone helped without being asked. She was tired of Blackmore. She was tired of the fence line watching and the remarks that traveled through the valley and the way people looked at her with that particular expression of sorrowful inevitability. She was tired of being the woman who could not be helped because she would not be stopped. She stood in the dark and counted stars until she could think clearly again. Then she found a fence post in the grass at the side of the road, worked it under the axle as a lever dug out the impacted mud from around the wheel with her hands, and pulled the wagon free in 11 minutes. She arrived home after midnight. She carried the tiles into the storage shed herself, one crate at a time. She did not set them down until the last one was in. Then she sat down on the floor of the shed next to them and did not move for a long time. That was the closest she came to stopping. She finished the system in the autumn of 1885. The clay tile intake channel ran from the north exterior of the cabin underground for 22 feet and descended to the stone-lined chamber at 7-foot depth. The stone walls of the chamber held the Earth's steady temperature. The central exhaust column rose through the floor and up through the roof, drawing a continuous current of earth-warmed air through the living space. The soapstone shelf sat above the point where the column emerged from the floor, mounted on iron brackets, ready to be charged with a small evening fire and left to radiate through the night. Every joint in the tile system was mortared and given 3 days to cure before the next section was attached. She tested the airflow with a candle held near the intake opening. The flame leaned steadily inward. The system worked. Her neighbors continued to notice the absence of a woodpile with increasing frequency as autumn deepened. Zilpha Dunbar, whose husband Levi ran a cattle operation half a mile south, had come by twice during the construction to see what Cordelia was doing. She was not the sort of woman who wasted time on cruelty, and she was not cruel now. The second time she came, she brought a jar of preserved peaches and said in her direct way, "I do not understand what you are building, but I do not think you are a foolish woman." The two statements seemed to satisfy Zilpha as a complete response to the situation, and she left shortly after. Cordelia ate the peaches that evening and thought that this was probably the most honest thing anyone had said to her in 6 months. In October, Mortimer Blackmore held an informal gathering at his equipment barn. He invited 12 men from the valley, framing it as a general discussion about winter readiness, which it partially was. He talked about wood supplies, about roof reinforcement against heavy snow loads, about keeping livestock shelters maintained. Then at a certain point, he brought the conversation around to Cordelia. He used careful language. He spoke of community responsibility. He suggested that given the apparent absence of winter fuel at the Gorham property, it might be prudent for someone to look in on her and assess whether she needed assistance, or he added whether there was some concern about her judgment that the community ought to be aware of. The room was quiet while he spoke. Most of the men nodded in the way men nod when they agree with something, but are not quite sure they want to commit to it. Dalton Bramwell sat near the back and said nothing. He was 45 years old, a rancher who had been in the valley 11 years, a man whose opinions Cordelia had come to understand as neither cruel nor particularly flexible. He had come to this meeting because Blackmore had asked him to, and because he generally respected Blackmore's practical knowledge. Then Calvert Weston stood up. Weston was 60 years old and had been in Harlan Creek longer than anyone else in the room. He was not a man who spoke often or loudly. When he did speak, people tended to listen, not because of any formal authority, but because of the simple accumulated weight of the years behind him. He stood and said, without raising his voice, "I saw a family in Minnesota build this way in 1849. The winter that year was one of the worst I ever saw. Their house was the warmest one in the settlement." Then he sat down. The room was quiet in a different way after that. Blackmore recovered quickly. He said that Minnesota was not Montana, that different conditions applied, and that the concern remained a reasonable one, regardless of what had been done elsewhere 40 years ago. He brought the conversation back to a conclusion that involved no formal action, just a general awareness that someone ought to keep an eye on the situation at the Gorham property as the serious cold approached. The meeting broke up. The men went home. Blackmore stayed behind in the barn after the last of them left, standing at the small window that looked south along the valley road toward the far end where Cordelia's cabin sat. No smoke rose from the chimney. The single candle in her window cast a faint rectangle of yellow light into the darkness. He stood there for a long time looking at that light, and whatever he was thinking, he kept to himself. Calvert Weston walked home from that meeting at a pace slower than usual. He had said what he had to say, and it had landed in the room and been dismissed, which was more or less what he had expected. He was 60 years old, and he had learned over the course of those years that a truth said once in a room is often not enough, but that a truth said twice in the same room to the same people becomes an argument, and arguments in small communities leave marks that outlast the original question. He had said it once. He had sat down. He would not say it again unless asked. But he carried it home with him, the fact of what he had seen in Minnesota in 1849. The way that family's house had been warm, when every other house was struggling, the way the man who built it had explained the principle with the calm assurance of someone describing a tool that had worked for his grandfather and would work for his grandchildren. Weston had been 23 that winter. He had not forgotten a detail of it in 37 years. He did not go to Cordelia's cabin the next day or the day after. He was not a man who made visits without reason, but he found himself over the following weeks paying more attention to the small signals the season was sending, the way the birds were behaving in October, the direction the first hard frost came from, the way the old ache in his left knee that had been his weather predictor for 15 years was speaking louder than usual. He thought about that winter in Minnesota. He thought about Cordelia Gorham and what she was building at the end of the valley road. He thought about the way knowledge gets lost, not through disaster or fire or flood, but simply through the passage of time and the failure of one generation to tell the next what it knew before it was too late to matter. 3 days after the meeting, 3 men arrived at Cordelia's door. Dalton Bramwell, Clement Ward, and Amos Tully. They had the polite, slightly uncomfortable look of men who have been given a task they did not fully volunteer for. Ward said it plainly. Mortimer Blackmore thought someone ought to check in. He used the phrase concern of the community. Cordelia looked at him for a moment. She asked, "Mr. Blackmore sent you?" Ward hesitated. She did not wait for the answer. She said, "I understand. Thank you for coming." And then she turned back to what she had been doing, which was stacking the last of her mountain ash in the bin beside the interior wall. The bin held by any reasonable estimate about 2 weeks of fuel. She carried each piece in one at a time from the small pile outside. The 3 men stood in her doorway watching her for a moment. Then they left. On the road home, Dalton Bramwell said little. That night, he described the visit to his wife Araminta, who listened to the whole account without interrupting. When he finished, she asked him one question. Did Cordelia seem afraid? He thought about it. He said no. Araminta said, "Then perhaps she knows something you do not." Dalton did not answer. He sat with that thought through supper and into the evening and found that he could not put it down entirely. A week later, on a gray Tuesday morning in early November, Dalton Bramwell came to Cordelia's cabin again with Clement Ward and a 3rd man. He carried an axe handle he had promised her months ago, a thin justification for a visit that was really something else entirely. He had been thinking about Araminta's question. He had been watching the sky, which had taken on a flat quality that the old-timer said was always the worst sign. He had done his own calculations about what kind of winter was coming. He found Cordelia outside stacking the last of her mountain ash. She greeted him. He carried the axe handle inside and set it by the door. Then he said what he had come to say quietly and without malice, as a man who believes he is being genuinely helpful. If the temperature dropped as low as it looked like it was going to drop a quarter cord of wood and a prayer, we're not going to see her through. He meant it as a warning. He meant her well. She thanked him. He left. On the road back, Blackmore was standing at the junction waiting. He asked if she had listened. Dalton said she had thanked them. Blackmore nodded and said January will tell. Dalton looked back down the road toward the end of the valley. The cabins sat quiet in the late afternoon light. No smoke from the chimney, a faint glow in the window. Everything about it looked like a mistake. He had lived in this valley 11 years. He had seen more than one winter take a person who was not prepared. He had never seen anyone this unprepared survive. He turned away and rode home. The cold came in earnest the week after that, a preliminary cold that was not the worst of it, but was serious enough to make wood burn faster than expected in every cabin in the valley. Cordelia's candle continued to burn in her window each night. No smoke rose from her chimney. The people of Harlan Creek watched and said very little to each other about it. There was not much left to say. They had warned her. She had not listened. January would tell. They were watching the wrong thing. They were watching for the smoke and not seeing it. What they could not see, what no one in the valley had thought to look for, was what was happening 7 feet beneath the floor of that quiet little cabin at the end of the road. The earth was keeping its promise. It had been keeping it for 30 years, since Gunnar Gorham set the first stone of the foundation and pressed his palm against the soil of this valley and recognized in the temperature he felt there's something he had known since childhood. Something his daughter now knew. Something in a few weeks the rest of Harlan Creek was about to learn in the only way that truly teaches, by running out of every other option. The storm did not build. It arrived. One morning, the sky was the flat, drained white that Calvert Weston had been watching for since October. The color that has no depth to it, no cloud structure, just a uniform erasure of everything above the ridgeline. By afternoon, the wind had shifted to the northwest. By nightfall, the temperature had dropped 17 degrees in 4 hours, and the snow was no longer falling so much as it was being driven horizontal and dense, packing itself into every gap and seam and knothole in every structure in the valley with a methodical, unhurried thoroughness that suggested something with patience and intention rather than mere weather. The thermometer outside the Dunbar barn read -38 degrees Fahrenheit on the first morning. By the second morning, it read -41. Small things filled first the way small things always do. The ink in Dalton Bramwell's writing jar seized solid overnight. A cast iron hinge on the Tully barn door cracked clean through from the thermal contraction. 3 chickens on the Pendleton property died between midnight and dawn, not from cold directly, but from the simple failure of their bodies to generate enough heat to stay alive in air that had dropped below any temperature their biology had been designed to handle. Roscoe Pendleton found them in the morning when he went out to check, stiff and light as paper in his hands, and he stood in the doorway of the coop for a moment before carrying them inside. He did not tell Laverna immediately. He put them by the back door and went to add wood to the fire first. The fire was eating wood at a rate that frightened him. In the first 18 hours of the storm, what had seemed like a reasonable supply began to reveal itself as something else. A fire that burned at a normal rate on a normal January night was now burning nearly twice as fast to maintain a temperature inside the cabin that was 20 degrees lower than what the family was used to. The drafts that came through the wall gaps, through the window frames, through the space beneath the door that had seemed insignificant in milder weather, were now continuous and bitterly cold, pulling the heat out of the room faster than the stove could replace it. Roscoe Pendleton had 4 children, the youngest of whom was a girl named Nell, just 4 years old. He had 2 cords of wood at the start of the storm. On the first day, he burned what he expected. On the second day, he burned more. By the end of the third day, he stood at the woodpile in the howling dark and counted what was left and understood that he had made a serious miscalculation. Not a lazy one, not a foolish one. He had followed every piece of advice he had ever been given about winter preparation in this valley, had asked Blackmore's opinion, In October had stacked what Blackmore told him was sufficient. It was not sufficient for this. He went inside and sat down at the table and then looked at his wife. Laverna was feeding the stove, her back to him, her shoulders carrying a set that he recognized as the posture of a woman who already knows something is wrong and is holding herself together by concentration alone. He did not say anything about the wood. He said he was going to check the animals. He went outside and stood in the wind for a while instead. Laverna Pendleton was not a woman who waited for problems to be brought to her. She had done her own counting. She knew by midday of the third day that they were burning through their supply faster than the storm was ending. That evening, after the children were under blankets, she said to Roscoe that they needed to think about what to do. He said that he had been thinking about going to Blackmore's place to ask for additional wood. Laverna was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He will give it to us, and we will owe him that for the rest of the time we live in this valley." Roscoe looked at her. She said, "I am not saying do not go. I am saying understand what you are doing when you go." Then she got up and checked on the children, and neither of them said anything more about it that night. They burned a chair on the fourth day. One of the plain wooden chairs from the kitchen table broken apart with the back of the hatchet and fed into the stove piece by piece. Laverna did it without comment. The children watched from under their blankets. Nell, the 4-year-old, did not understand fully what was happening, but she understood the chair was gone, and she watched her mother's face while it burned. Thomas, who was 12, was old enough to understand everything. He sat against the wall with his knees pulled to his chest and watched his father stack the chair pieces beside the stove, and he did not say anything. But he looked at Roscoe with an expression that Roscoe felt in a place that had nothing to do with the cold. He went outside after that to check the animal shelter and stood in the wind for a long time before coming back in. The fifth morning of the storm brought a particular quality of stillness that was worse than the sound of the wind had been. The wind had been violent and knowable. This was something else, the deep cold that settles in after the initial fury when the temperature drops into ranges where sound itself seems to stop traveling normally, where the air has taken on a glassy density that makes you aware of it as a substance rather than an absence. Roscoe stepped outside at first light, and the cold hit him like a physical object against his chest. He stood for 30 seconds and went back inside. He did not tell Laverna the temperature. She did not ask. There were 4 pieces of split wood left beside the stove. Roscoe looked at them for a while. He thought about the small table in the corner of the second room. He thought about the box frame of Thomas's bed. He thought about the wooden handle of the water bucket and how much heat it would produce compared to how long it would take to burn. Then he put his coat on and went to find Dalton Bramwell. Half a mile north of the Pendletons, Drusilla Tanner had stopped putting wood on her fire sometime in the night of the third day. Not because she chose to, but because she ran out. She was 68 years old and had been a widow for 12 years, and she had lived alone in a cabin that was smaller than most in the valley, a fact that had seemed like a practical economy when her husband Isaac was alive, and now simply meant there was less space to heat and less margin for error when the fuel ran short. When her neighbor, a man named Theron Ashford, fought his way through 4-foot drifts to check on her on the 4th morning, he had to put his shoulder against the door twice before it gave. The latch had not been thrown. The wood had simply settled against the frame in the cold and stuck. Inside, the cabin was very cold. Not as cold as outside, but cold enough that Ashford could see his breath clearly, and cold enough that what he saw when he looked at Drusilla Tanner stopped him in the doorway. She was sitting on the floor with her back against the far wall, wrapped in everything she owned: 2 coats, 3 wool blankets, a horse blanket borrowed from the shed, and all of it piled and layered over her like she had pulled the whole room onto herself. She was talking, her eyes were open, and she was talking in a low conversational voice to someone who was not in the room. She was calling her husband's name. She was asking Isaac whether he had eaten. She was asking him to come sit closer to the fire. Her voice was calm, and her face was calm, which was somehow the most frightening part of it. Ashford crossed the room quickly and took her hands. They were very cold. He spoke her name loudly, and she looked at him, and for a moment her eyes did not quite register where she was. Then something came back into her face, a slow and painful return, like a person surfacing from very deep water. She said his name. She said she was cold. He told her he knew. He told her he was going to take her somewhere warm. She nodded as if she had expected this, as if the logistics of survival were something she was willing to leave to other people now. He got her onto a horse. Mortimer Blackmore did not lose his fire. He did not run out of wood. He had prepared more carefully than anyone in the valley, and he was in purely material terms better positioned to survive this storm than most of his neighbors. He had 4 cords laid in before the first hard frost, and even at the accelerated burn rate that the storm demanded, he could calculate with confidence that he would have enough. What he had not calculated for was the cold itself. His cabin was the best-built structure in Harlan Creek. He had framed it himself, knew every joint, had caulked and chinked every gap he could find. But even a well-built cabin of that era was at its core a wooden box with a fire in it and a wooden box in minus 40-degree air with a sustained northwest wind pressing against every surface will find its limits. The interior walls of Blackmore's cabin began to show frost on the inside surface by the second night. Not ice, not condensation, but actual frost crystals forming on the plank walls in the corners farthest from the stove, a sight that a man in his position did not expect to see in his own home and did not look at for long. He added wood. The frost retreated from the corners. He added more wood. By the third day, he was burning at a rate he had not planned for, and the gap between his projected consumption and his actual consumption was growing in a direction he did not like. On the 4th morning, he did what he always did when he needed to think. He went outside. He walked the perimeter of his property in the wind, checking the roof, checking the animal shelters, doing the visible work of a man being productive. While underneath he was running numbers he did not want to run. He had enough wood. He was certain of that. But certainty was a thinner margin than he preferred, and the storm showed no sign of weakening. The sky was the same featureless white it had been on the first morning. The wind had not changed direction. There was no reason to believe the next 2 days would be easier than the last 4. He stood at the edge of his property and looked south along the valley road. Through the blowing snow at the far end, where the trail curved toward the hillside, he could make out the shape of the small cabin. No smoke above the roofline. Even in this storm, even at this distance, the absence was unmistakable. He went inside, he sat down. He picked up a piece of wood and turned it over in his hands without adding it to the fire. He put it back down. He sat for a while longer. Then he put on his coat and went out into the storm. He told himself he was checking on road conditions, that the path to the south end of the valley needed to be assessed in case there was a need for evacuation or supply movement. He told himself this was practical, rational, a reasonable thing for a man in his position to do. He believed approximately half of it. The walk took longer than it should have. The drifts in the road had built to waist height in places, and he had to go around them or push through them, and the wind cut through his coat in a way that reminded him with uncomfortable specificity what minus 40 felt like on a body that was moving rather than sheltered. By the time the cabin came into full view, he was breathing hard, and his face was burning despite the wool scarf pulled up to his eyes. The candle was still burning in the window. He stood outside for a moment, then he knocked. Cordelia opened the door within a few seconds. That was the first thing he noticed, a few seconds, not the long wait of someone pulling themselves out of blankets or dragging themselves up from a state of cold-induced lethargy. She had been awake and moving. She looked at him with an expression that was neither welcoming nor hostile, simply attentive, the look of a person who has registered an unexpected event and is waiting for more information before deciding what it means. The warmth hit him before he could frame a thought about it. It came through the open door in a wave that was not dramatic, not the blast of heat from a roaring fire, but something steadier and deeper, a warmth that did not seem to come from any specific direction, but from the room itself, from the air and the floor and the walls, as if the building had been holding it for a long time and was simply releasing it evenly in all directions. Blackmore stood in the doorway and felt it on his face and his hands and the front of his coat, and he did not immediately speak. He looked into the room. No fire in the hearth, no visible coals. The soapstone shelf above the floor column glowed faintly, but there was no flame, no active combustion of any kind. The room was warm, genuinely fully warm, the kind of warm that a man registers not as comfort, but as evidence the way a carpenter registers a joint as either square or not square. He said, "How many people can you take?" Cordelia looked at him for a moment. She said, "Enough." He nodded. He did not ask to come in. He turned and went back out into the storm. He walked to Dalton Bramwell's cabin and knocked until Dalton answered. He told Dalton that the Pendleton family needed to be brought to Cordelia's place. He said it flatly as a logistical fact without elaboration. Dalton looked at him for a long moment. He said he had been thinking the same thing for the last hour. He said he would go. Blackmore went back to his own cabin. He sat down and added wood to the fire. He sat for a while looking at the fire, the only man in the valley still burning and still cold. Then he got up, put his coat back on, and went out again. This time he did not tell himself a reason. Dalton Bramwell reached the Pendleton cabin in the early afternoon of the fourth day. He found the family in 2 rooms, the children under every blanket they had, Laverna feeding a chair leg into the stove, with the focused calm of a woman who has passed through fear and come out the other side into something colder and more efficient. She looked up when Dalton came in and said, "Are we going somewhere?" He said yes. She said, "Give me 10 minutes." She had the children dressed in every layer that existed in the cabin inside of 8 minutes. They came to Cordelia's door in the late afternoon, all 6 of them, moving slowly through the drifts, the youngest children stumbling and being pulled upright by whichever adult was nearest Roscoe, carrying Nell against his chest, with his coat closed over her because her feet kept breaking through the crust, and she was too tired to pull them free. Cordelia had the door open before they reached it. She had water on. She had blankets out from the chest under her bed unfolded and laid near the center of the room near the column that rose through the floor. When the door opened and the warmth came out, Laverna Pendleton stopped walking for a single step. Just one step, a hesitation so brief that Roscoe did not notice it. Then she kept moving. She got the children inside and got them to the blankets and got the smallest 2 settled, and then she sat down on the floor and did not move for a while. Cordelia did not speak to her. She brought water and set it nearby and went back to what she had been doing. Nell had been carried in against her father's chest with her face turned inward against his coat. When Roscoe set her down in the warm room and she felt the floor through her boots, she looked down. She looked up at her father. She did not say anything. Laverna's face did something that she turned away quickly to hide from the children, but Dalton Bramwell saw it from across the room and looked away to give her privacy. By the time darkness came, 8 people occupied the cabin. Calvert Weston arrived in the early evening without announcement. He knocked once Cordelia opened. He looked at the room, looked at her, and said, "Only I told them I had seen it before." Cordelia said, "I know." He came in and sat in the far corner near the exhaust column and did not speak again for the remainder of the evening. He was the oldest person in the room, and he sat with the stillness of someone who has earned the right to simply be present without explaining himself. Theron Ashford brought Drusilla Tanner on horseback the next morning, leading the horse by the bridle because she could not manage the reins reliably. She was wrapped in so many borrowed layers that her face was barely visible, and she was still shaking with the deep involuntary trembling that happens when a body has been cold for too long and does not yet trust the warmth even when it is real. Cordelia took her by the arm and guided her to the spot nearest the column, the warmest point in the room, and settled her there with 2 wool blankets and did not ask her anything or speak to her at all for a full hour. She just let the heat do its work. Drusilla Tanner stopped shaking after 90 minutes. She leaned against the wall and her eyes closed, and she slept for 11 hours. When she woke up, the first thing she said to no one in particular was that she had dreamed of summer. The 5th day brought Blackmore. He arrived in the afternoon alone without the weather check pretext he had used the day before. He simply knocked. Dalton Bramwell opened the door. The 2 men looked at each other. Neither of them said anything for 3 seconds that were long enough to constitute a full conversation. Then Blackmore stepped inside. There were 14 people in the room by then, neighbors and their children who had come through the night before, its conditions at their own cabins deteriorated beyond managing. They sat and lay on every flat surface on the floor near the column against the walls, 2 children asleep across a folded horse blanket in the corner. The room was warm. It was not dramatically warm, not the overwhelming heat of a banked fire, but the deep, even sourceless warmth that had been there every time anyone entered this cabin, the warmth that did not fluctuate and did not depend on anyone adding anything to anything. Blackmore stood in the center of the room and looked around at it. He did not sit down immediately. He looked at the column, he looked at the floor, he looked at Cordelia. Cordelia was sitting near the back wall reading to Nell from a thin book, her voice low and even. She looked up when he entered. She saw him. She looked back down at the book and kept reading. She did not pause. She did not acknowledge him further. She simply continued reading to the child in her lap, as if Mortimer Blackmore, standing in the middle of her cabin after a year of organized opposition, was a matter of no particular significance. Zilpha Dunbar, sitting near the east wall where she had been since the previous evening, watched Blackmore from across the room with an expression that made no effort to conceal what she thought. Blackmore took his coat off after 2 minutes. He sat down near the door. He sat in the coldest part of the room, the farthest from the column, where the draft that came under the door was most noticeable. He was still warmer than he had been in his own cabin, with a full fire running. The room had developed over 4 days its own quiet social order. People had found their places on the floor and returned to them. The children had claimed the space nearest the column, not because anyone arranged it that way, but because children moved toward warmth instinctively, and the adults had let them. Drusilla Tanner slept in the corner nearest the east wall, still wrapped in her borrowed layers, her breathing now regular and deep. Calvert Weston had not moved from his corner since the first evening. He ate when Cordelia brought food and returned to his corner and sat, and the young ones had come to treat him as a fixed feature of the room, the way children treat the oldest person in any gathering as someone who belongs to a category different from ordinary people. Cordelia herself did not stop moving. She kept the soapstone charged on its small daily ration of split mountain ash, never more than 5 pieces, never for more than 2 hours, and the stone radiated through the night as it always had. She made food from what was available in the cabin's soups that stretched thin but stayed hot in the pot above the column's rising warmth. She checked on Drusilla every 2 hours through the first night. She had given her own sleeping position near the column to Laverna Pendleton and the 2 smaller children, and slept herself near the door, which was the coldest spot in the room, and which she appeared to regard as of no particular consequence. Dalton Bramwell watched her from across the room on the evening of the 5th day, and have found that he was thinking about the November visit, about standing in her doorway, and telling her that a quarter quart of wood and a prayer were not going to be sufficient. He thought about how certain he had been. He thought about the particular ease of certainty, how little it requires of the person holding it, how nothing in the world is cheaper than being confident about someone else's mistake. He did not say any of this out loud, but he sat with it, and it was not comfortable, and he did not try to make it comfortable. That night, sometime around 2 in the morning, Blackmore woke, not from cold, which was itself a change so unfamiliar that it registered as a kind of wrongness before he understood it as relief. He lay on the floor in the darkness and listened. 18 people breathed around him in various registers of sleep. The wind was still pressing against the walls outside. The temperature had not risen. Everything outside the cabin was the same as it had been for 5 days. But the room was quiet in a way that a room heated by fire is never quiet, because fire makes sounds: the crackle and shift of burning wood, the tick of expanding metal, the irregular sigh of combustion. This room made none of those sounds. There was only the breath of the people, and underneath it so faint that you had to hold your own breath to hear it, the very small sound of air moving through the clay column at the center of the floor. A sound like the earth breathing, patient and steady and utterly indifferent to the storm. Blackmore lay there and listened to it for a long time. He thought about the 2 years since Cordelia Gorham had begun digging. He thought about the morning he had walked to Silas Pendleton's yard in Millerton and spoken to Pendleton quietly for 10 minutes about a widow woman with questionable judgment and uncertain finances. He had believed what he said at the time, or had told himself he believed it, which amounted to the same thing, until you were lying in the dark at 2 in the morning, in that woman's cabin, listening to the earth breathe through a system she had built with her own hands, in a dead man's notebook, warmer than you had been in 6 days in your own cabin, that you had built with 20 years of professional knowledge and every advantage you could have claimed. He was not a man given to what he would have called excessive introspection. He had built things for 40 years, and the building had always been its own justification, its own answer to questions about purpose and value. But something about lying on that floor in the dark, surrounded by 18 people who were alive and warm, for a reason that had nothing to do with him, made the usual answers feel insufficient. He had spent 20 years being the person people came to. He had spent 2 years making sure that this particular piece of knowledge did not get a fair hearing. He had done it with careful words and quiet influence, rather than any overt action, which had made it easy not to look at directly, but which did not change what it was. He did not sleep again until nearly dawn. The storm broke on the morning of the 6th day. The wind dropped first abruptly and completely, as if a door had been shut somewhere. Then the temperature began to climb in the rapid, disorienting way it climbs after a sustained cold snap, 12 degrees in 3 hours. and the sudden relative warmth felt strange and slightly wrong to bodies that had calibrated to extremity. People moved slowly at first, cautiously, like people who have been told good news and are waiting for it to be corrected. The men went out to dig paths to the animal shelters. The women took stock of what food was left and what would need to be done. The children stood in the flat white light outside the cabin door and squinted at the sky as though they had not seen it in a long time and needed to relearn what it was. It took most of the morning to understand the full shape of what the storm had done to the valley. The coop on the Tully property had collapsed inward under the accumulated snow load, and the birds inside had not survived the 2 days before anyone found them. A section of road near the northern end of the valley had drifted to a depth that made it impassable by horse until the men of 3 families worked it with shovels for most of the afternoon. An elderly man named Percy Crandall, who had lived alone in a cabin on the eastern slope for 14 years and had declined every offer of help during the storm, on the grounds that he had managed worse, was found on the 6th morning sitting at his table alive but badly frostbitten in 2 fingers of his right hand, which he had lost the feeling in sometime on the 4th night and had not told anyone. He lost the fingers eventually in the spring to a doctor who came out from Millerton. He said afterward that he would have come to the Gorham cabin if he had known the road was still passable. Nobody believed him, and nobody said so. Calvert Weston walked the valley road that morning at a pace that seemed slow, but covered ground, steadily checking on each property in turn, saying little, noting what needed doing. He had done this after every major storm since 1862. People saw him coming and told him their damages and their needs without being asked, because they had learned over the years that telling Calvert Weston something was the most efficient way of making sure it was known by everyone who needed to know it by nightfall. Dalton Bramwell walked out into the road and turned and looked back at the cabin. He stood there for a while. The roof line was clear. The chimney cap sat silent. No smoke. The same absence he had shaken his head at in November, the same absence he had interpreted as evidence of a mistake being made. He stood in the cold morning air and looked at it and understood in a way that was complete and unhurried and entirely free of the need for any further evidence that he had been looking at it wrong the entire time. He heard footsteps in the snow behind him. Blackmore had come out and was moving along the road in the direction of the Gorham cabin. He did not stop to talk. He did not look back. He simply walked his head down against the cold with the purposeful stride of a man who has decided something and is acting on it before he can reconsider. Dalton watched him go. He said nothing. He did not need to. The morning after the storm had a quality that was hard to name. The light was the same thin winter light it always was in January, coming flat and without warmth from a sky that had gone from white to pale gray, but everything it fell on looked different. The drifts had built to shapes that rearranged familiar landmarks. The road was gone under 4 feet of packed snow. The valley that 41 families had been living in for years looked in the aftermath of those 6 days like a place that had been thoroughly tested and was taking stock of what remained. What remained was considerable, but so was what had been lost. Levi Dunbar lost 2 head of cattle and a lean-to shed whose roof had given way under the accumulated snow load on the 3rd night. He found them when he dug out his property. On the morning after the storm broke, the shed collapsed into a low mound of timber and snow, the cattle beneath it. He stood looking at the mound for a while before he called for help. Zilpha watched him from the cabin doorway and did not say anything. She had already begun making a list in her head of what the family could absorb and what it could not, the way practical people do when something bad has happened and sentiment is a luxury that has to wait. The Pendleton family emerged from Cordelia's cabin on the morning of the 7th day, all 6 of them intact. Roscoe carried Nell on his shoulders through the drifts on the road because her legs were not long enough to manage the depth. Laverna walked beside him with the 2 middle children, one on each hand, and the oldest, a boy of 12 named Thomas, walked ahead of all of them, breaking trail. They did not speak much on the way home. There was a great deal to assess and repair, and they were people who assessed and repaired rather than talked about assessing and repairing. Drusilla Tanner stayed at Cordelia's cabin for 2 more days after the storm broke. She was not incapacitated, but the cold had taken something from her that did not return immediately, a kind of efficiency in her movements, a steadiness in her hands. Cordelia did not suggest she leave and did not suggest she stay. She simply continued to make food and keep the room at its usual temperature and treat Drusilla's presence as unremarkable, which was perhaps the most useful thing she could have done. On the second morning, Drusilla sat at the table while Cordelia worked and said without much preamble, "Isaac would have understood what you built here." She did not explain who Isaac was. She did not need to. Cordelia said, "I think most people would if someone had shown them when they were young." Drusilla thought about that. Then she said, "Mortimer Blackmore is not most people." Cordelia did not answer immediately. She kept working. Then she said, "No, he is not." Dalton Bramwell came to the cabin door on the morning after the storm alone and without pretext. No axe handle this time, no thin justification. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands, a gesture so plainly deliberate that it required no explanation, and said, "I told you that you would not survive. I was wrong. And I said it in front of other people. That was also wrong." Cordelia looked at him for a moment, the look of someone receiving information they had been waiting for without knowing they were waiting. She opened the door wider and told him to come in. She told him she would show him her father's notebook. He sat at the table and read it. Not quickly, not scanning, but working through it the way a man reads a technical document when he intends to act on it. Cordelia made tea and did not interrupt him. He read for nearly an hour. At one point, he turned a page and then turned back and read the same page again. He looked up only once when he reached the section recording the chamber dimensions and asked, "You dug this alone?" She said, "2 summers." He nodded once and returned to reading. When he finished, he closed the notebook carefully and set it on the table and sat with his hands flat on his knees for a moment. Then he said, "I would like to build this for my property. I have 2 sons who can dig." He paused. "I would need someone to tell me if I am doing it correctly." Cordelia said, "I will walk your land with you in the spring. We will find the right position for the chamber." Dalton said, "What do you want for it?" She considered this. She said nothing. He started to object and she said, "Leave it." He left it. He picked up his hat and stood and then stopped at the door and said one more thing. He said, "Calvert Weston told me in October that he had seen this done in Minnesota in 1849. I did not give it the weight it deserved." Cordelia said Calvert came here the first night of the storm. He sat in the corner all evening and did not say a word. Dalton thought about that. He said, "That sounds like Calvert." He put his hat on and went out. Mortimer Blackmore came in the afternoon. He came alone as Dalton had, and without pretext as Dalton had, but there the similarity ended. Where Dalton had carried the particular discomfort of a good man who had made a reasonable mistake and knew it, Blackmore carried something heavier. He stood at the door after knocking and waited for it to open, and when Cordelia opened it, he did not speak immediately. He looked at her face, then looked briefly past her into the room, then looked back at her. He was holding his hat in both hands at his waist, turning it slowly. He said, "I went to Silas Pendleton in Millerton before you placed your order for the tile. I told him you were not reliable. He refused your order because of what I said." Cordelia said nothing. He said, "I also organized the men who came to your door in October. That was my doing. I told them it was community concern. It was not only that." Cordelia was still looking at him. Her expression had not changed. She was not performing composure. She was simply composed the way a person is composed when they have already spent a long time with a difficult truth and arrived somewhere on the other side of the acute part of it. She said, "I know. The young man at the yard Burkett Eastwick told me afterward what had been said." Blackmore absorbed that. The hat turned once more in his hands. He said, "I want to learn how to build what you built. Not for myself necessarily. For the families here who need to rebuild before next winter." He stopped. Then he added with a directness that seemed to cost him something, "I have been the person people came to in this valley when they needed to know how to build. I told them things that were not wrong exactly, but that were not complete. This winter showed that. I would rather know the complete thing." It was not an apology in the conventional form. It contained no explicit statement of regret, no request for forgiveness. But Cordelia had spent her entire adult life in a community where what men said directly and what they meant were often 2 different quantities. And she understood that what Blackmore had just done was a great deal more difficult than it appeared. He had come to her door. He had named specifically what he had done. He had asked to learn from her. For a man who had built his entire standing on being the person who knew the act of asking was the substance of the apology, even if the word itself never appeared. Zilpha Dunbar was in the room behind Cordelia. She had come that morning to help clear the aftermath and had stayed because there was still work to do. She was standing near the east wall, and she heard everything. She did not move or speak. She simply watched. Cordelia turned and looked at the notebook on the table, then turned back. She said, "You will need to read my father's notebook from the beginning to the end before I explain anything to you in person. All of it." Blackmore said he understood. She said, "When you have read it, come back." He said he would. He put his hat back on. He looked at her once more with an expression that had no name she could give it, then turned and walked back down the path he had made through the snow. Cordelia closed the door. She stood facing it for a moment. Zilpha said nothing from across the room. Cordelia turned around. The two women looked at each other. Then Cordelia went back to what she had been doing. Neither of them spoke about it again. They did not need to. 3 weeks after the storm, a young man walked into Harlan Creek from the Millerton Road. He arrived on foot 12 miles in late January, cold, which was unusual enough that the first person he passed on the Valley Road stopped to look at him. He was about 19, strongly built, with hands that were roughened from physical work in a directness of manner that made him seem older than he was. He asked the man on the road where he could find the Gorham cabin. The man pointed south without hesitation toward the far end of the valley. The young man thanked him and kept walking. Burkett Eastwick had read the article in the Millerton Courier 3 days after it was published, standing at the back of Silas Pendleton's supply yard with the paper folded to the relevant page. The headline read, "The Woman Who Heats Her Home with the Earth Itself." He read it twice. Then he folded it and put it in the inside pocket of his coat. Pendleton had been standing behind him and had read over his shoulder. When Burkett finished, Pendleton said quietly, "I should have filled that order myself." Burkett said, "Yes, you should have." Neither of them said anything further. Burkett went back to work and counted the days until his day off. He knocked at Cordelia's door on a Thursday morning. She opened it. He said, "My name is Burkett Eastwick. I work at Pendleton's yard in Millerton. I want to learn to build what you built, not just to watch it, to do it myself." He paused. "I have been digging since I was 17. I know materials. I want to know this." Cordelia looked at him for a moment in the considering way she looked at things when she was taking a genuine measurement rather than a social one. She asked if he could read a technical diagram. He said yes. She asked if he had any fear of working in confined underground spaces. He thought about it honestly and said he did not think so, that he had spent 2 years in the back of a kiln trench and had not found it troubling. She nodded. She said the Bramwell family will be ready to begin in April. Be here by the 1st of the month. He was there on March 28th. The work on Dalton Bramwell's property began in the first week of April, when the frost had retreated enough from the upper soil layers to make digging possible. Dalton's 2 sons, both in their 20s and accustomed to heavy labor, did the main excavation. Burkett worked alongside them, learning the angles, learning the depth calculation, learning how to read the soil as it changed character below the clay layer and entered the pale mineral earth that did not vary with the season. Cordelia came twice a week to check progress and correct what needed correcting. She did not praise what was done correctly. She simply moved on, which the Bramwell boys came to understand over those weeks was how she indicated that something was right. Blackmore came to the Bramwell property on a Tuesday in late April. He had read the notebook. He arrived in the morning, found Cordelia measuring the intake channel with a knotted cord, and stood at the edge of the excavation and watched for a while before she acknowledged him. She handed him the notebook, open to the page on chamber dimensions, and said, "Look at the depth notation and tell me what you see." He read it. He said the chamber floor should be at 7 feet 2 inches, not 7 feet flat, because the soil composition here runs warmer than average at that depth. Cordelia said, "Correct." "How did you know that?" He said, "I have been digging foundations in this valley for 20 years. I know what the soil does." She said, "Good. That is useful." She handed him a shovel. He dug for 4 hours that day. He came back the next day and dug again. He did not talk much while he worked, which Cordelia found suited her. She observed, the kind of man who thought through his hands rather than through conversation, who worked problems out by doing rather than by discussing, who arrived at an answer through action and then presented the answer as if it had been obvious all along. She recognized this disposition. She shared it. There were moments in those early weeks when the strangeness of what was happening was difficult to ignore entirely. Mortimer Blackmore was in her excavation following instructions from a notebook written by her father, building a system that Blackmore had spent 2 years calling a grave. He was good at the physical work in the way that 20 years of skill makes a person good, efficient, economical in movement, precise with his measurements. He asked questions rarely, and when he did, they were technical rather than personal, which Cordelia preferred. He did not apologize again after the first day, which she also preferred. The apology had been made in the only form that mattered, which was showing up and doing the work. Dalton Bramwell's sons, watching Blackmore work one afternoon, exchanged a look that their father caught and did not comment on. He understood it. He had been in that same place of adjustment himself, the recalibration that happens when a person you have understood as one thing reveals themselves to be something more complicated. It was not comfortable, but it was Dalton had decided a more accurate picture of the world than the simpler version he had held before January. By the end of the second week, Blackmore had developed through the combination of the notebook's instructions and his own 20 years of material knowledge, a working competence with the system that moved faster than Cordelia had expected. On a Thursday afternoon, he looked at the stone lining he had set in the eastern wall of the chamber and said to no one in particular the thermal contact would be better if the stones were set with their flat face inward rather than their edge. Cordelia, working at the opposite wall, did not look up. She said it would. He set the remaining stones flat face inward. Neither of them mentioned it again. There was a moment in the third week of April that Cordelia did not speak of to anyone. She was checking the intake channel alignment late in the afternoon alone at the Bramwell property after the others had gone home, when she found herself kneeling at the base of the excavation with her father's notebook open on her knee, comparing his measurements to the dimensions she had just taken, and the two sets of numbers matched so precisely across 30 years, in two different valleys, in two entirely different soils, that she sat back on her heels and did not move for a while. It was not surprise exactly. She had trusted the notebook all along, had built her own system on its numbers, and found them true. But there is a difference between trusting something and having it confirmed again from outside yourself by the work of your own hands against the standard of a man who had been gone for 8 years. She sat in the bottom of that excavation in the April mud and looked at the two sets of numbers and felt something she could not have named precisely, but that had somewhere in it the quality of a conversation resumed. She closed the notebook. She climbed out. She went home. The journalist from the Millerton Courier rode out to Harlan Creek in early March when the roads had opened enough to make it possible. He had heard about the storm from a freight driver who had passed through the valley in February, and the freight driver had told him about a woman who had housed 19 people for 6 days of the worst blizzard in recent memory on almost no fuel and with no fire visible from the road. The journalist found this improbable enough to investigate, and true enough once he arrived to write about at length. He spent 2 hours at Cordelia's cabin with a small notebook. She answered his questions in the measured, unhurried way she did everything without embellishment and without false modesty. When he asked if she wanted her name used, she said, "My name is not the important thing." He said, "Stories need a person." She said, "Then use my father's name." He came from Norway with this knowledge. I dug the hole. He wrote both things down. The article appeared in the Courier on March 14th under the headline, "The journalist had chosen the woman who heats her home with the earth itself." It was the first time the principle of passive earth channel heating had been described in print for an American readership this far west. Within 2 weeks, it had been reprinted in 2 Helena papers and 1 in Bozeman. A professor of agricultural science at a college in Ohio wrote to the Courier requesting more technical detail. The letter was forwarded to Cordelia. She read it once, set it on the shelf above the soapstone, and did not take it down again. Burkett Eastwick completed the system for Calvert Weston's property that June, working largely on his own. This was for Burkett a different kind of work than anything he had done at Pendleton's yard. At the yard, he had been learning a trade that other people had defined, following procedures that existed before he arrived and would continue after he left. Here he was building something that almost no one else in Montana knew how to build, from a notebook written by a man who had been dead for nearly a decade under the oversight of that man's daughter, who had herself built the only other completed version of this system within several hundred miles in any direction. He thought about this sometimes while he dug. Not with anxiety, but with a particular kind of attention. The attention you bring to something that you understand is not routine. He had come to Harlan Creek on a day off in January cold because he had read a newspaper headline and followed it to its source, which was itself an unusual thing to do at 19. And the thing he had found at the source had not disappointed him. He was learning in the physical grammar of soil and stone and fired clay a way of thinking about problems that he suspected would be useful for the rest of his life, regardless of what work he did. You looked at what was already there. You worked with it rather than against it. You let the stable thing do the work that stability could do, and you saved your effort for the parts that required actual effort. Cordelia had agreed to check his work at the midpoint and at completion, and he had agreed to stop and wait for her assessment before proceeding past each of those points rather than push through on his own judgment. He was 19 years old and had been doing skilled physical work for 2 years, and he had the particular confidence of a young person who has learned quickly and knows it. Cordelia recognized it and did not discourage it, but she also held him to the checkpoints firmly, which he accepted without argument. At the midpoint inspection, she found the intake channel laid correctly and the chamber walls begun with soundstone selection. She noted 2 things: the mortar mix was slightly dry, which would create hairline fractures under freeze and thaw pressure, and the entry angle of the intake pipe was 2 degrees too shallow, which would reduce airflow in summer when the pressure differential was naturally lower. Burkett corrected both without being told twice. He asked her why 2 degrees made a material difference, and she explained it once clearly, and he did not ask again. At the final inspection, she found the chamber complete, the column properly aligned, and one additional feature she had not specified. Along the eastern wall, Burkett had set an extra course of flat stones at floor level, fitted tightly against the earth face and extending the thermal contact surface by roughly 30%. It was not in the notebook. It was not something she had told him to do. She stood and looked at it for a long time. She said, "Who showed you this?" He said, "No one. I thought about the surface area problem, and it seemed like the obvious answer." She looked at the stones. She looked at him. She said, "It is the obvious answer. It will improve the chamber performance in the shoulder seasons when the differential is smallest." He said, "That is what I thought." She nodded and moved on to the next wall. She did not tell him that evening what she did when she got home. She opened her father's notebook to the section on the underground chamber, found the blank space in the margin beside the thermal contact notes, and wrote in handwriting as small and precise as his flat course addition at floor level, 30%, surface increase, significant benefit in shoulder season. She attributed it with 2 initials and the year. B, 1887. The summer passed and then another winter and the winter after that. Dalton Bramwell recorded the interior temperature of his cabin every morning at 6 o'clock in a small logbook he kept on a nail by the door. Over 112 consecutive winter days, his average morning reading was 59 degrees Fahrenheit. His previous average with 4 cords of wood and a cast iron stove running through the night had been 44. He showed Cordelia the logbook the following spring, setting it open on the table in front of her. She looked at the numbers. She said, "Your chamber is positioned well. The soil on your property holds temperature better than mine." He said, "Is that common?" She said, "It depends on the rock composition below the clay layer." He said, "I will tell the boys." She said, "Yes, tell them." Blackmore rebuilt the heating system for 2 families in the valley that second year and a 3rd family the year after. He did the work for reasonable compensation, not the premium he had charged for conventional framing work, and he did not advertise what he was doing in any formal way. The families he worked for simply told other families the way knowledge travels in small communities, person to person carried in conversation. It was different work from what he had done before in ways that were not only technical. When he had framed cabins and laid foundations and sold timber, he had been the authority, the source, the man whose judgment you trusted because he had more experience than you and knew it. Now he was something different, a man who had learned a thing from someone else and was passing it on, which required a different relationship to his own knowledge and a different kind of honesty about where it had come from. He found somewhat to his surprise that he did not mind this as much as he would have expected. The work was still good work. The judgment was still his, applied to each property's specific conditions, each soil's particular character. What had changed was not the quality of the work, but the story he told about it, and telling the true story turned out to be on balance easier than maintaining the other one. By the winter of 1889, there were 7 properties in Harlan Creek, using variations of what Cordelia had built beneath her floor in 1885. Each one adapted to the specific geometry of the land, the specific depth at which stable temperature was reached, the specific character of the soil, each one built by different hands with different material judgments applied within the same fundamental principle. Blackmore came to Cordelia's door one morning in the autumn of 1889, not for instruction but to tell her something. He stood in the doorway and said, "The Tully family asked me last week who had taught me this system." He paused. "I told them it was your father's design and your construction and your knowledge, that it was yours." Cordelia looked at him. She said, "Thank you." He said, "I should have said that in 1884 when you started digging." She said, "Yes, you should have." He looked at her for a moment. He said, "I know." He put his hat on and left. It was the closest he ever came to saying it plainly. For Mortimer Blackmore, it was a great distance to have traveled, and Cordelia knew it, and she let it be enough. Burkett Eastwick remained in Harlan Creek through the winter of 1887 and into the following year. He found work at the Dunbar Ranch and later at a mill that opened on the eastern edge of the valley. But his real work, the work he kept coming back to on his days off and in the long evenings of the shoulder seasons, was the continuation of what Cordelia had started. He built systems for 3 more families over the next 4 years, each one more refined than the last, incorporating the surface area modification he had developed for the Weston property, and adding 2 further improvements that came from his own observation of how air moved through the underground spaces at different times of year. Before he left the valley in the spring of 1891 to take work further west, he came to Cordelia's cabin and sat at her table for an afternoon. They talked about the system in the technical way they had always talked, which was the only way they talked about pressure differentials and soil composition and the behavior of clay tile mortar in extreme freeze conditions. At the end of the afternoon, she took the notebook from the shelf and set it on the table between them. She said, "I want you to have this." He looked at it. He said, "This was your father's." She said it was. "And I have added to it, and you have added to it, and now it needs someone who will continue to add to it." He said he was not sure he was the right person. She said, "You put that stone course in without being asked. You are the right person." He picked up the notebook and held it for a moment and said nothing further. Then he put it carefully in his coat pocket and buttoned the pocket closed. Cordelia Gorham lived in that cabin for 31 more years after the storm of 1887. She did not become famous in the valley in the way that dramatic people become famous. She became something quieter and more durable than famous. She became known. Not for the storm, or not only for that, but for the specific quality of her knowledge and the specific way she held it without performance and without pride as a tool that worked and was therefore worth sharing with anyone willing to learn to use it correctly. People came to her door over the years for various reasons, some practical and some not entirely practical, and she received them all with the same measured attention she had brought to every problem since childhood. She answered questions directly, declined to speculate about things she did not know, and returned without commentary to whatever she had been doing when the visitor arrived. She was not warm in the way that people sometimes mean by that word, as a quality of surface and manner. She was warm in the way that her floor was warm steadily, deeply, and without any particular effort to be noticed. She died in the winter of 1918, 65 years old, of causes that the local record described only as decline of health. She was buried in the small community cemetery east of the settlement road under a plain stone marker with her name and the years of her life. No epitaph. She would not have wanted one. The work was the epitaph, and the work was in the ground where no stone marker could reach it. The cabin stood for 40 years after her death, passed through 2 subsequent owners who used it as storage and then as a seasonal shelter, neither of whom knew what was beneath the floor. By 1959, the structure was derelict. The roof compromised the walls, leaning at angles that made the building a hazard rather than a shelter. A county road expansion that year required the site to be cleared. The work crew that came to demolish the cabin pulled up the floorboards in the first hour and found the floor joists sound beneath them, which surprised the foreman, a man named Dale Whitmore, who had grown up in the valley and whose grandmother had been among the 19 people who spent the 6th day of the 1887 blizzard in this room. When they cut through the subfloor and found the clay tile columns still in place and still intact after 7 decades, Whitmore told the crew to hold. He climbed down into the space beside the column and looked at it. He ran his hand along the mortar joints, pressing gently with his thumb at each junction. Not a single one gave. The tiles were set in the same formula Gunnar Gorham had recorded in his notebook in the 1850s, mixed and applied by his daughter's hands in the summer of 1885 and in the 80 years since through cycles of freezing and thawing that had crumbled stone foundations and rotted iron implements and collapsed timber structures all across the same valley. Not one joint in that system had failed. The excavation crew began on the underground chamber after that. They found the stone-lined walls intact, the floor of bare, compacted mineral earth undisturbed, the intake channel running in its correct line from the north exterior, buried at 7 feet of depth, sealed at every junction. One of the younger workers asked what it was. Whitmore explained it as best he could. The young man looked at it and said, "Someone built this by hand." Whitmore said, "A woman. Alone. She started in 1884. The young man looked at it for another moment and said nothing. Whitmore stood in the excavated trench for a long time before giving the order to proceed. He looked at the system the way you look at something that has outlasted everything around it and earned through that fact alone a form of authority. The crew waited. He knew they were waiting. He did not rush. He stood in that trench in the January air and looked at what Cordelia Gorham had built, and he thought about his grandmother, who had told him about this room with a specificity that he understood only now, the way the floor felt warm when you pressed your hand to it, the way the air was deep and even and did not fluctuate, the way 19 people had slept here in the worst storm in the valley's memory and woken up alive and warm. He looked at the thermometer one of the survey crew had placed in the chamber wall earlier that morning. It read 51 degrees Fahrenheit, same as it had read when Cordelia pressed her father's thermometer to the earth wall in the summer of 1884. Same as it would read tomorrow morning and the morning after that, and in every January that followed, regardless of what the sky decided to do. He gave the order. The machinery moved forward. The road runs over that place now. It has run over it for 60 years. If you drive it on a January morning when the temperature has dropped past -30 and the sky has gone that flat, drained white, that the old-timers said was always the worst sign you are driving over ground that does not know the cold is there. You are driving over earth that has been at 51 degrees since before anyone in this valley was born and will be at 51 degrees long after the last of them is gone. You are driving over the place where a woman knelt in August heat and pressed a mercury thermometer to the soil and confirmed with a precision that satisfied her completely what her father had told her when she was 8 years old. He was right in the mountains of Telemark when he learned it. He was right in the soil of Montana when he built it. He was right when he took his daughter's hand on a cold night and led her down into the earth and told her to take off her mitten and feel. The earth does not remember seasons. Go deep enough and the earth only remembers itself. She knew that. She built on it, and what she built held. Not for a season, not for a decade, but for the full span of a life and past it through everything the sky could do and everything the years could take into the ground that remembered nothing except its own steady temperature, patient and permanent. The same on the day the machines came as it had been on the day a woman knelt in the August heat and pressed her father's thermometer to the wall and found that the earth had kept its promise exactly.